The diamond necklace sparkled under the restaurant's crystal chandelier like a cruel mockery of everything I'd once believed about love and family. I watched from across the room as my daughter Jessica fastened the $25,000 Cartier piece around Victoria Sterling's neck, both of them giggling like schoolgirls while the entire dining room turned to stare. "Happy birthday, Victoria," Jessica announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "From your loving family." If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I need to know I'm not alone in this madness. Me? Well, let me show you what this loving family got their actual mother for her 68th birthday. I held up the small plastic succulent in its dollar store pot, the kind of fake plant you buy when you're running late and grab the first thing you see at a gas station. $5. Maybe $6 if you're being generous about tax. After 42 years of raising Jessica, after every sleepless night when she was sick, every dollar I spent on her private school education, her college tuition, her wedding that cost more than most people's houses, her business loan that I co-signed when the bank wouldn't approve her a loan. $6. It's symbolic, Mom, Jessica had explained with that patronizing tone she'd perfected since Victoria Sterling entered our lives 6 months ago. "You always said you could make anything grow, so we thought this would be perfect for your new apartment." My new apartment. Because apparently, at 68 years old, I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of downsizing from the family home I'd lived in for 30 years so that Victoria could move into the guest house and be closer to her Jessica. I watched Victoria link arms with my daughter, both of them admiring the way the diamonds caught the light. Victoria had appeared in our lives like some fairy godmother, swooping in after my husband Richard passed last year with her perfect silver hair, designer clothes, and seemingly endless bank account. Somehow she'd managed to become Aunt Victoria, while I, the woman who actually gave birth to Jessica, had been demoted to just Patricia, and apparently only worth $6. The private dining room at Le Bernardin, yes, they'd rented out a private room for Victoria's 65th birthday buzzed with conversation about Victoria's generosity, her wisdom, her impeccable taste. 25 guests, each meal costing more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. But hey, at least I got invited, right? I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment away from the celebration of the woman who'd somehow replaced me in my own daughter's affections. That's when I saw Victoria's purse sitting unattended at the coat check, a black crocodile skin Hermes bag that probably cost more than my car. How careless of her to leave something so valuable behind. How very careless indeed. Inside the stall, I opened Victoria's purse with the same careful attention I'd once used examining suspicious lab results during my 30 years as a medical technologist. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The wallet contained the usual suspects: credit cards, cash, driver's license. But it was the folded documents tucked behind her insurance cards that made my hands shake. Bank statements. Multiple accounts across different institutions. Our dear Victoria wasn't just well off, she was extraordinarily wealthy. The kind of wealthy that makes a $25,000 necklace look like pocket change. But it was her phone that revealed the real truth. Message after message from someone named David Sterling, presumably her son, though she'd told Jessica she had no living family. The messages painted a picture of a devoted child worried about his mother's whereabouts and activities. "Mom, please call me back. The lawyer says we need to discuss the Henderson account." The investigator found 3 more potential targets. "When are you coming home?" "Mom, I'm worried about this Jessica situation. You've been gone too long." Targets. The word hit me like a physical blow. I scrolled further back and found photos that made my stomach drop. Pictures of our house, our neighborhood, screenshots of property records showing the value of our home, and most disturbing of all, photos of Richard's obituary and estate filings. Victoria Sterling hadn't randomly befriended my grieving daughter. She'd been hunting us. I quickly took photos of the most incriminating messages with my own phone, then carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it. When I returned to the dining room, Victoria was telling a heartwarming story about how Jessica had rescued her from loneliness after her husband's death. "Jessica has been like the daughter I never had," Victoria said, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. After losing my Harold, I thought I'd never feel part of a family again. The daughter she never had. While her actual son sent increasingly frantic messages about targets and accounts and investigations. I watched my daughter's face glow with pride at being needed, at being special to this sophisticated woman who seemed to have stepped out of a magazine. Jessica had always been hungry for approval, for recognition, for the feeling that she was important. Victoria had identified that vulnerability and exploited it perfectly. "Patricia," Victoria turned to me with that warm smile that had fooled my daughter completely. "I hope you know how lucky you are to have raised such a wonderful woman. Jessica has told me so much about you." I smiled back, my face a mask of polite interest. "Oh, really? What kind of things?" "Well, how independent you are. How you've always been so self-sufficient. She mentioned you're looking forward to simplifying your life now that Richard is gone." Simplifying my life. Is that what Jessica called it when she suggested I sell the house and move into a senior living community? When she said the property was too much responsibility for someone my age? "I've heard wonderful things about you too, Victoria," I replied sweetly. "Jessica mentioned you have family in California?" For just a moment, Victoria's smile faltered. "Oh, well, distant relatives. We're not close." Not close. Yet her son David had called her 12 times just today, according to those missed call notifications I'd seen. The dinner continued with toasts to Victoria's health, her friendship, her generous spirit. I sat there smiling and nodding while my mind raced through everything I'd discovered. By the time dessert arrived, I had a plan. 3 days later, I called Jessica and asked her to bring Victoria over for coffee. I'd been doing some research into investment opportunities, I told her. Maybe Victoria could give me some advice. They arrived at my house, soon to be my former house if Victoria's plan succeeded, with Victoria carrying a leather portfolio that screamed serious financial advisor. She dressed for the role too, in a conservative navy suit that made her look trustworthy and professional. "Patricia, I'm so glad you're thinking about your financial future," Victoria said, settling into Richard's favorite chair like she belonged there. "Too many women your age ignore these important decisions." Women my age. I was only 3 years older than Victoria, but she spoke as if I were ancient and doddering. "Well, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner. About simplifying. Maybe it's time to be more strategic about my assets." Victoria's eyes lit up with barely concealed excitement. "That's very wise. Property maintenance can be such a burden, especially for someone living alone." Jessica leaned forward eagerly. "Mom, Victoria knows some excellent financial advisors. People who specialize in helping seniors transition their assets efficiently." Transition their assets. Another euphemism for theft. "I'd love to hear more about these specialists," I said, pouring coffee from Richard's good china set, the one Victoria had admired multiple times. Victoria opened her portfolio and spread out a collection of impressive-looking documents. "I work with a very exclusive wealth management firm. They handle high-net-worth clients who need discretionary, sophisticated strategies." The presentation was smooth, professional, and completely fraudulent. Victoria explained how I could sell my house to an investment group, then lease it back at a very reasonable rate, while my money was invested in overseas opportunities that would generate exceptional returns. It was almost identical to the scam I'd read about in the AARP bulletin just last month. "This sounds complicated," I said, playing the confused elderly woman perfectly. "How do I know these people are legitimate?" "Patricia, I understand your caution," Victoria said with practiced sympathy. "That's why I only work with clients who are referred by people I trust completely. Like Jessica." My daughter beamed at being called trustworthy by her new mother figure. "The initial investment would be around $800,000, Victoria continued. "That would cover the house sale plus your savings and Richard's life insurance settlement." How did she know about Richard's life insurance? I'd never discussed those details with Jessica, at least not in Victoria's presence. $800,000 seems like a lot, I said carefully. "It's actually conservative based on your asset portfolio," Victoria replied without missing a beat. The projected returns would net you over $200,000 annually. Much more than your current fixed income. She'd done her homework. She knew exactly what Richard's pension paid, what my Social Security looked like, probably what I had in every account. I'll need to think about this, I said finally. Victoria leaned forward, her mask slipping slightly. Of course, but I should mention that this particular opportunity is time-sensitive. The investment group only takes new clients quarterly, and the next window closes in 2 weeks. Create urgency. Pressure the mark to decide before they can think clearly or consult anyone who might talk sense into them. After they left, I sat in Richard's chair and called the one person I knew could help me verify what I suspected about Victoria Sterling. My nephew Marcus was a private investigator in Seattle, and when I told him what I'd discovered, he whistled low. Aunt Patricia, this sounds like a sophisticated long con. Professional level stuff. How much do you think she's planning to take you for? Everything, Marcus. The house, the savings, the insurance money. Probably close to $1 million when it's all added up. Jesus. And your daughter doesn't suspect anything? I looked at the fake succulent Jessica had given me for my birthday, sitting on the mantelpiece next to family photos that Victoria would soon want removed. My daughter is so desperate to replace the mother she thinks disappointed her that she can't see she's being played by a professional. What do you want me to do? I want you to find out everything there is to know about Victoria Sterling. Real name, background, family, criminal history if any. Everything. That could take a few days. I've got time, Marcus. Victoria thinks she's playing chess with a lonely old widow. She's about to learn that this widow has been studying the game for longer than she realizes. While Marcus worked his investigation, I did some digging of my own. I started with Victoria's son David, whose messages I'd photographed. A simple Google search revealed David Sterling was indeed real, a successful attorney in Los Angeles specializing in estate planning and elder law. But the interesting part was his professional bio, which mentioned his work with law enforcement on financial crimes against vulnerable populations, and his mother's role as a retired victim advocate. Victim advocate. Either Victoria had changed careers dramatically, or David had no idea what his mother was really doing. I called his office, using my sweetest grandmother voice. Hello, dear. This is Patricia Davis from New York. I'm calling about David's mother, Victoria. We've become such good friends here, and I wanted to invite her to my granddaughter's wedding next month. The receptionist was immediately warm. Oh, how wonderful. Mrs. Sterling will be so pleased. She talks about her New York friends all the time. But I should let you know she's actually been in Los Angeles this week visiting David. Would you like me to give you their home number? My blood went cold. This week? Are you sure? Oh yes, she arrived Monday for David's birthday celebration. Such a devoted mother. It was Thursday. Victoria had been having coffee with Jessica and me on Tuesday, supposedly in New York. Either the receptionist was confused, or Victoria Sterling was in 2 places at once. Actually, I said carefully, I may have mixed up my dates. What's David's birthday? Tomorrow, the 15th. Victoria's been planning this surprise party for months. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking. Victoria had told Jessica she was attending a medical appointment Tuesday, which was why she'd seemed distracted during our coffee meeting. But she'd actually been in Los Angeles, probably planning her next move with her son. Which meant either David was part of the con, or Victoria was lying to him too. My phone rang and Marcus's name appeared on the screen. Aunt Patricia, you're not going to believe what I found. Try me. Victoria Sterling is her real name, but she's been using it for less than 2 years. Before that, she was Victoria Hendricks, and before that, Victoria Chen, and before that, Victoria Martinez. She changes identities every few years. Criminal record? Clean as a whistle, which actually makes it worse. She's either very good at not getting caught, or she's never been properly investigated. But here's the interesting part. I found references to 3 other elderly victims over the past decade. 2 in Florida, 1 in Texas. Combined, they lost over $2 million. What happened to them? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Aunt Patricia, two of them died shortly after the thefts were discovered. Natural causes, but the stress of losing everything, it takes a toll. I thought about my fake succulent and Jessica's eagerness to help Victoria simplify my life. Marcus, I need you to do something else for me. I need you to find out everything you can about David Sterling. Is he part of this, or is he another victim? You think she's conning her own son? I think Victoria Sterling is capable of anything if the price is right. 2 days later, Marcus called back with news that changed everything. David Sterling isn't Victoria's son. What? I mean, he is, but not biologically. She married his father when David was 12, adopted him legally, then divorced the father 3 years later and kept the Sterling name. David's real mother died when he was 10. The pieces clicked into place. Victoria had essentially stolen someone else's child, raised him just long enough to establish legal family ties, then used that relationship to create her perfect cover identity. Does David know? That's the million-dollar question. His father died 5 years ago, right around the time Victoria started her current pattern of targeting elderly widows. Either David's been helping her all along, or she's been manipulating him as much as anyone else. How do I find out which? Very carefully, Aunt Patricia. If David's innocent and you contact him directly, Victoria will know you're onto her. But if he's part of the scam, then I'm walking into a trap. I spent that night sitting in Richard's chair, holding the birthday succulent and thinking about Jessica's glowing face when Victoria praised her. My daughter wasn't evil, she was lonely and grieving and desperate for someone to need her. Victoria had recognized that vulnerability and exploited it masterfully. But Jessica was still my daughter, and I wasn't going to let some professional predator destroy what was left of our family. The next morning, I called Victoria directly. Hello, dear. I've been thinking about our conversation and I'd like to move forward with your investment proposal. The excitement in her voice was unmistakable. Patricia, that's wonderful news. I think you're making a very smart decision. I do have one request, though. I'd like to meet with your associates in person before signing anything. I know it's old-fashioned, but I prefer to look people in the eye when I'm trusting them with my life savings. There was a pause. Of course, Patricia. Let me arrange something for next week. Actually, I was hoping we could do it sooner. Maybe this weekend? I know Jessica is anxious for me to get this settled so she can stop worrying about my future. Another pause, longer this time. Well, let me see what I can arrange. These are very busy people, but for the right client. I understand. Oh, and Victoria? I hope you don't mind, but I've invited my nephew to sit in on the meeting. He's a financial advisor himself, and he's offered to review the paperwork to make sure I understand everything. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Your nephew? Marcus Davis. He works in Seattle, but he's coming to visit this weekend anyway. He's such a sweet boy, always looking out for his old aunt. I see. Well, that should be fine. I'll call you back with the details. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I smiled. Victoria Sterling was about to discover that this particular Mark had family who asked uncomfortable questions. Friday evening, Jessica arrived at my house with Victoria and 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as associates from the firm. They looked like actors hired to play investment advisors, which is probably exactly what they were. Marcus had arrived that afternoon and I'd briefed him on everything I'd discovered. He was posing as my financial advisor nephew, but his real job was to ask the kinds of questions that would make Victoria's fake investment team squirm. Gentlemen, Marcus said, shaking hands with Victoria's associates, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with my aunt. I have some questions about the investment structure you're proposing. For the next hour, Marcus systematically dismantled their presentation. He asked for SEC registration numbers that didn't exist, references from other clients they couldn't provide, and detailed explanations of investment strategies they clearly didn't understand. Victoria watched her carefully constructed scam fall apart with increasing desperation. Perhaps we should reschedule, she finally suggested, when we have more time to address all of Mr. Davis's concerns. Oh, I think we have plenty of time, Marcus replied smoothly. In fact, I've been researching your firm all week, and I have some very interesting findings to share. He pulled out a folder and spread photos across my dining room table. Pictures of Victoria's previous victims, newspaper articles about their deaths, and financial records showing the pattern of theft. Victoria Hendricks. Victoria Chen. Victoria Martinez. Marcus looked directly at her. How many names have you used over the years? Jessica gasped, looking back and forth between Marcus and Victoria like she was watching a tennis match. I don't know what you're implying, Victoria said, but her voice was shaking. I'm not implying anything, Marcus replied. I'm stating facts. You've been running the same con for over a decade. Identify wealthy elderly widows, gain their trust through their children, then steal their assets through fake investment schemes. One of Victoria's associates was already edging toward the door. The interesting question, Marcus continued, is whether your son David knows what you've been doing. Victoria went very still. My son has nothing to do with this. Doesn't he? Because according to the messages on your phone, he's been asking about targets and accounts and demanding updates on the Jessica situation. I pulled out my own phone and showed her the photos I'd taken of her messages. You left your purse unattended at the restaurant, Victoria. Very careless for someone in your line of work. The room exploded into chaos. Victoria's associates bolted for the door. Jessica started crying. Victoria herself just sat there staring at the evidence of her deception spread across my table. Mrs. Sterling, Marcus said formally, I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for attempted fraud. I've already contacted the FBI. As if on cue, sirens sounded outside. Mom, Jessica sobbed, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I put my arms around my daughter for the first time in months. I know, sweetheart. Victoria is very good at what she does. She fooled a lot of people. As the FBI agents led Victoria away, she looked back at me with something almost like respect. You're not the helpless old woman I thought you were. I smiled, thinking about the fake succulent that had started this whole investigation. No, Victoria. I'm really not. The aftermath of Victoria's arrest revealed the true scope of her operation. FBI agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Victoria's previous identity, debriefed me over several sessions about what they discovered during their investigation. Mrs. Davis, you helped us uncover one of the most sophisticated elder fraud networks we've seen, Agent Chen explained during our second meeting. Victoria Sterling wasn't working alone. She had contacts in real estate, finance, and even healthcare who helped her identify and research potential victims. The network was staggering in its complexity. Victoria had cultivated relationships with funeral directors who would provide information about recent widows. She had contacts at banks who would alert her to large insurance payouts or estate settlements. She even had accomplices in senior living facilities who would identify residents with substantial assets but strained family relationships. How many victims were there? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. We've identified at least 15 over the past decade, but we suspect there are more. The total amount stolen exceeds $5 million. $5 million. 15 families destroyed. Lives ruined not just financially but emotionally and psychologically. Agent Chen continued, what made Victoria particularly dangerous was her ability to maintain long-term relationships with her victims' families. Most con artists grab the money and run. Victoria would sometimes spend a year or more building trust before making her move. I thought about the 6 months Victoria had spent cultivating Jessica's affection and dependency. How patient she'd been, how perfectly she'd played her role as the caring friend and substitute mother figure. The psychological profiling we've done suggests Victoria specifically targeted families dealing with grief and guilt, Agent Chen explained. She had an uncanny ability to identify adult children who felt they'd failed their parents in some way. Then she'd position herself as the solution to that guilt. That explained Jessica's vulnerability perfectly. My daughter had always carried unnecessary guilt about not being the perfect child, about choosing her career over starting a family, about not visiting enough during Richard's final illness. Victoria had identified those weak spots and exploited them ruthlessly. "Mrs. Davis, can I ask you something?" Agent Chin leaned forward. "What made you suspicious when other victims' families weren't? We've interviewed relatives of previous victims, and most of them still defend Victoria even after learning about her crimes." I considered the question carefully. "Agent Chen, I spent 30 years as a medical technologist. My job was to analyze evidence, spot inconsistencies, and question assumptions. When something didn't make sense, I was trained to dig deeper rather than accept surface explanations. But there was more to it than professional training. I think the real difference was that I never stopped believing in my own competence. Victoria's method depends on convincing elderly people that they're declining, that their judgment is failing, that they need someone else to make decisions for them. I refuse to accept that narrative about myself." Agent Chin nodded. "That's exactly what our psychologist said. Victoria's victims typically had some underlying insecurity about aging or competence that she could exploit. You didn't give her that opening." Over the following weeks, as more details emerged about Victoria's network, I learned that my case had been particularly important because I'd documented everything so thoroughly. The photos I'd taken of her phone messages, the journal I'd kept of her lies, the recordings Marcus had made during our final confrontation, all of it provided crucial evidence that would help convict not just Victoria, but her accomplices. "Your nephew's investigation was particularly valuable," Agent Chen told me. "His background as a private investigator meant he knew exactly what evidence we'd need to build a strong case." Marcus had indeed been thorough. He'd traced Victoria's financial network, identified her previous victims, and even discovered that some of her investment associates were actors she hired for specific cons. The men who'd come to my house that final evening weren't financial advisors, they were unemployed actors Victoria had recruited through online casting calls. The depth of the deception was almost admirable in its complexity, if it hadn't been so destructive. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when Agent Chin shared Victoria's psychological profile with me. "Mrs. Davis, our psychologist believes Victoria genuinely enjoyed the emotional manipulation as much as the financial gain. She didn't just want to steal from her victims, she wanted to completely dominate their relationships and decision-making processes." This explained why Victoria had been so patient with Jessica, so willing to invest months in building a relationship before moving toward the financial payoff. She'd been enjoying the process of gradually replacing me in my daughter's affections. "In some cases," Agent Chen continued, "Victoria continued manipulating family members even after the financial theft was complete. She seemed to get satisfaction from maintaining control over people's emotions and relationships." The thought made me sick. Victoria hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been collecting psychological trophies, savoring her ability to destroy family bonds and replace them with manufactured dependencies. I asked Agent Chin about David Sterling, Victoria's adopted son who'd testified against her. "That's perhaps the most tragic part of this case," she replied. "David truly believed his mother was a retired victim advocate doing volunteer work with seniors. Victoria had been lying to him for years about her activities. David's testimony had been heartbreaking to watch. A successful attorney who'd built his career fighting elder abuse, discovering that his own mother was one of the predators he'd dedicated his life to stopping. "He's agreed to help us identify any other victims," Agent Chin said. Victoria kept detailed records of her activities, apparently as some kind of trophy collection. David's been going through her papers to help us contact families she targeted. The records Victoria kept were chilling in their clinical detail. She'd maintained files on dozens of potential victims, complete with psychological profiles, family dynamics analysis, and strategic plans for manipulation. My family's file was particularly thick, suggesting she'd been studying us for months before making her first approach. "Mrs. Davis, there's something else you should know," Agent Chin said during our final meeting. Victoria's been talking to our psychologists, and she's expressed particular frustration about your case. What kind of frustration? She keeps saying you broke the rules. That elderly victims aren't supposed to be capable of the kind of investigation and strategic thinking you demonstrated. She seems genuinely angry that you didn't conform to her expectations about how older people behave. I found this oddly satisfying. Victoria Sterling had built her career on assumptions about elderly vulnerability and decline. My refusal to fit her stereotypes had disrupted not just her scam, but her entire worldview about aging and competence. The trial, when it finally occurred, was a media sensation. The story of the elderly woman who outsmarted a professional con artist captured public imagination, and I found myself fielding interview requests from news programs and magazines. I declined most of them, but I did agree to speak at a few senior centers about recognizing and avoiding financial scams. The most rewarding part was seeing the faces of elderly audience members when I described my investigation techniques. "You mean we don't have to just accept what people tell us?" asked one woman in her 80s. "We're allowed to ask questions and demand proof?" "Not only allowed," I replied, "but obligated. Your experience and judgment are valuable assets. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. But more importantly, remember that getting older doesn't mean getting less capable. It means getting more experienced, more knowledgeable, and often more intuitive about when something isn't right. The courtroom was packed the day Victoria was sentenced. Jessica sat beside me, holding my hand as the judge delivered his verdict. 12 years in federal prison, plus restitution to all identified victims. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she looked directly at me one final time. There was no respect in her eyes now, only cold fury at being outmaneuvered by someone she'd considered an easy mark. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only relief that she couldn't hurt anyone else and gratitude that my family had emerged intact from her web of deception. But the story doesn't end with Victoria's conviction. In the months that followed, as Jessica and I rebuilt our relationship, I learned valuable lessons about family, aging, and the importance of trusting your instincts. The first lesson came during one of our weekly coffee meetings, about 2 months after the trial. Jessica had been unusually quiet, stirring her latte without drinking it. "Mom," she said finally, "I need to ask you something and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, sweetheart." During those months with Victoria, did you ever doubt yourself? Did you ever think maybe you were being paranoid or suspicious for no good reason? I considered the question carefully. Every day. Victoria was very good at making me feel like I was the problem. She had a way of making reasonable questions seem unreasonable and legitimate concerns seem like paranoid delusions. Jessica nodded slowly. I felt that too, but in reverse. She made me feel like I was finally understanding things I'd been blind to before. Like I was becoming smarter and more sophisticated under her guidance. That's exactly how these predators work, Jessica. They don't just attack your finances, they attack your confidence in your own judgment. They make you doubt what you know to be true. How did you keep trusting yourself? I thought about those dark nights when I'd lain awake wondering if I was losing my mind, if grief over Richard's death had made me suspicious and paranoid. I wrote everything down, I said. Every conversation, every inconsistency, every time something didn't feel right. When you document things, you can see patterns that might not be obvious in the moment. Jessica pulled out a small notebook from her purse. I've been doing that too. Writing down the things Victoria said and did, trying to understand how I got so confused about reality. Over the next hour, Jessica shared her notebook with me. Page after page of observations about how Victoria had gradually changed her perceptions, not just about me, but about herself. She convinced me that I was more intelligent than I'd realized, Jessica explained. She said you and Dad had always treated me like I couldn't handle complex thinking, so I'd never developed confidence in my own abilities. This was news to me. Jessica, your father and I always encouraged you to think independently. We were proud of your intelligence. I know that now. But Victoria was so skillful at rewriting history. She'd take a normal family interaction and reinterpret it as evidence of your limitations or control issues. Reading Jessica's notebook was like seeing a psychological autopsy of our family relationships. Victoria had systematically identified every moment of normal family tension or disagreement and reframed them as evidence of dysfunction. The scariest part, Jessica continued, is how logical it all seemed at the time. Victoria never asked me to reject you completely. She just gradually shifted my perspective until I saw everything through her lens. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Victoria's manipulation. She hadn't asked Jessica to stop loving me, she changed Jessica's definition of what love looked like. She convinced me that enabling your independence was actually selfishness on my part, Jessica said. That loving daughters take control when their mothers can't make good decisions anymore. I realized that Victoria's psychological manipulation had been even more sophisticated than I'd understood. She hadn't just been planning to steal my money, she'd been planning to steal my daughter's capacity for independent judgment. Jessica, what helped you break free from her influence? Seeing the evidence you'd gathered. Having concrete proof that she'd been lying about everything. But also, Jessica paused, looking uncomfortable. What? When Victoria was arrested, my first emotion wasn't shock or betrayal. It was relief. Deep down, some part of me knew something was wrong, even though I couldn't admit it to myself. This confession led to a much deeper conversation about family dynamics, aging, and the challenges of maintaining relationships across generations. We talked about how easy it is for adult children to fall into patronizing behaviors with their parents, especially after a major loss like Richard's death. I think part of me wanted to take care of you because I felt guilty about not being there enough during Dad's illness, Jessica admitted. Victoria tapped into that guilt and redirected it toward controlling your choices instead of supporting them. Over the following months, these conversations became a regular part of our healing process. We established new patterns of communication, where Jessica asked about my decisions instead of making assumptions about my capabilities. More importantly, we developed a family code word, succulent, that either of us could use when we felt the other was being patronizing or dismissive. It was our way of honoring the lesson learned from that fake birthday plant. The second major lesson came from an unexpected source, David Sterling, Victoria's adopted son. About 6 months after Victoria's conviction, he reached out to me through Agent Chen. Mrs. Davis, I know this might be strange, but I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. I have some things I need to say. We met at a quiet cafe in Manhattan, and I was struck by how much David resembled the man I'd imagined Victoria's fictional herald to be. Tall, distinguished, with kind eyes that seemed to carry a heavy burden. Mrs. Davis, I want to apologize for what my mother put you and your family through, he began. I know I wasn't directly involved, but I feel responsible for not seeing what she was becoming. David, you were a victim too. Victoria manipulated you just as much as she manipulated us. He shook his head. I've been thinking about this for months, and I realized there were signs I chose to ignore. Times when her stories didn't add up, when her explanations for her activities seemed evasive. David explained that Victoria had been gradually isolating him from her daily life for several years. She'd moved to New York claiming she wanted independence, but maintaining regular contact through phone calls and visits. She was very good at giving me just enough information to feel connected, while hiding the details that would have raised red flags, he said. I knew she was meeting new people and becoming involved in social activities. I thought she was finally healing from my father's death. What she was doing had nothing to do with you, David. She made conscious choices to prey on vulnerable people. But that's the thing, Mrs. Davis. Looking back at my childhood, I can see patterns of manipulation that I normalized because she was my mother. She was always very good at making people feel special, then using that feeling to get what she wanted. David's perspective gave me new insight into how Victoria had developed her skills. She'd been practicing psychological manipulation for decades, probably starting with small-scale family dynamics before graduating to large-scale financial fraud. The hardest part, David continued, is accepting that the person who raised me, who taught me about right and wrong, who encouraged me to become a lawyer fighting for justice, that same person was systematically destroying other families. We talked for over 2 hours, and I found myself in the odd position of comforting the son of the woman who'd tried to destroy my life. But David's guilt and confusion were genuine, and he needed to process his experience with someone who understood the scope of Victoria's deception. Mrs. Davis, can I ask you something? How do you forgive someone who betrayed your trust so completely? The question caught me off guard because I'd been struggling with it myself. Not just forgiving Victoria, but forgiving Jessica for her part in the deception, and even forgiving myself for not recognizing the threat earlier. I don't think forgiveness is a single event, I said finally. I think it's a process, and some days are better than others. But I've learned that holding on to anger only gives Victoria continued power over my life. David nodded thoughtfully. My therapist says something similar. That healing happens when we stop letting the betrayer's actions define our future relationships. Before he left, David shared something that helped me understand Victoria's psychological profile even better. Mrs. Davis, Victoria kept detailed journals about her projects. That's what she called her victims. Reading them was horrifying because she wrote about your family like you were characters in a story she was writing. The journals, which had been seized as evidence, revealed that Victoria saw her cons not as theft, but as elaborate forms of entertainment. She genuinely enjoyed the intellectual challenge of manipulating people and took pride in her ability to rewrite family dynamics. She rated her victims based on how difficult they were to manipulate, David explained. You received her highest difficulty rating because you kept questioning her narrative instead of accepting it. This information was both validating and disturbing. Validating because it confirmed that my suspicions had been justified. Disturbing because it showed how Victoria had reduced human relationships to a game where other people's pain was her pleasure. As I reflected on everything I'd learned from David, I realized that Victoria's true crime wasn't just financial theft. It was the theft of trust itself, not just between her and her victims, but within families, between generations, and even within individuals who learned to doubt their own judgment. The third and perhaps most important lesson came from an unexpected conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was 92 and had been living independently in her own home for over 20 years since her husband's death. I was telling her about the Victoria situation during one of our weekly garden chats, and she listened with the kind of focused attention that only comes from genuine wisdom. Patricia, she said when I finished, may I tell you something I learned during my first year alone? Of course. The hardest part about getting older isn't the physical changes or even the loneliness. It's other people's assumptions about what you can and can't handle. Everyone wants to help, but sometimes their help is really about making themselves feel better rather than making you feel supported. Mrs. Patterson's words crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand about Jessica's behavior during the Victoria period. I think your daughter got confused about the difference between supporting you and controlling you, she continued. Victoria exploited that confusion very skillfully. How do you tell the difference? Support asks what you need. Control assumes it knows what you need. Support offers options. Control presents solutions as if they're the only reasonable choice. This distinction became a cornerstone of Jessica's and my rebuilt relationship. We learned to be explicit about when we were offering support versus when we were making suggestions, and we gave each other permission to say no without explanation or justification. But Mrs. Patterson had more wisdom to share. Patricia, there's something else you should know. What you did investigating Victoria, gathering evidence, protecting your family, that takes courage most people don't have at any age. Don't let anyone convince you that being careful or suspicious is a sign of decline. Sometimes it's a sign of wisdom. Her words helped me understand that Victoria had tried to weaponize ageism against me. She'd used societal assumptions about elderly vulnerability to make my legitimate concerns seem like paranoid delusions. The best defense against people like Victoria, Mrs. Patterson concluded, is refusing to act the age other people think you should be. These 3 lessons about trusting your instincts, understanding manipulation, and rejecting ageist assumptions became the foundation for a new phase of my life. I started teaching workshops at senior centers about financial fraud prevention, but with a focus on psychological tactics rather than just financial red flags. I emphasized that con artists like Victoria prey on self-doubt and social expectations about aging. Your experience is an asset, not a liability, I would tell my audiences. Your skepticism is wisdom, not paranoia. Your questions are legitimate, regardless of how anyone else responds to them. The workshops were surprisingly popular, and I began getting invitations to speak at community centers, libraries, and even police departments' training sessions. Each presentation reinforced my own healing process while hopefully preventing other families from experiencing what Jessica and I had endured. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source, Agent Chen, who called me about a year after Victoria's conviction. "Mrs. Davis, I wanted to let you know that your case has become a training example for our financial crimes unit. The documentation you provided and the investigation techniques you used are now part of our educational materials." She explained that many elder fraud cases fail to reach prosecution because victims either don't recognize they're being scammed, or they're too embarrassed to report it, or their families convince them they're imagining things. Your case shows investigators what's possible when victims trust their instincts and document everything systematically, Agent Chen said. You've probably helped prevent dozens of similar crimes just by showing people that fighting back is possible. The knowledge that my experience might protect other families gave new meaning to everything I'd endured. Victoria Sterling had intended to make me a victim, but instead, she'd accidentally created an advocate. 6 months later, Jessica and I were having coffee in my kitchen, the kitchen I still owned, in the house I still lived in. Victoria Sterling was awaiting trial for multiple counts of elder fraud, and the FBI had recovered nearly $3 million she'd stolen from various victims over the years. David Sterling, it turned out, was completely innocent. Victoria had been lying to him about her activities, claiming she was volunteering with senior centers when she was actually hunting for victims. When he learned the truth, he testified against her and helped the FBI trace her network of fake identities. "Mom," Jessica said, setting down her coffee cup, "I owe you the biggest apology of my life." "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. You were grieving your father and looking for family connection. Victoria exploited that. But I treated you so badly. The birthday gift, the pressure to sell the house, acting like Victoria was more important than you." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Jessica, grief makes us do things we wouldn't normally do. Victoria studied our family, learned our vulnerabilities, and used them against us. You're not the first person to be fooled by a professional con artist." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing everything that had happened. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you know to investigate her? What made you suspicious?" I looked at the fake succulent sitting on my windowsill, now surrounded by real plants Jessica had brought me as an apology. Real plants that required care, attention, and love to flourish. "The birthday presents," I said simply. "You gave a woman you'd known for 6 months a $25,000 necklace, and your mother who raised you for 42 years got a plastic plant. That's not who you are, Jessica. That's who Victoria convinced you to be." Jessica started crying again. "I'm so ashamed." "Don't be ashamed. Be grateful we caught it before she succeeded. And be proud that when it mattered most, you listened to the truth instead of defending the lie." As Jessica prepared to leave, she hugged me tightly. "Mom, I want you to know that you're the strongest person I've ever met. I'm lucky to be your daughter." After she left, I walked through my house, my home that Victoria had tried to steal, and thought about everything that had happened. Victoria Sterling had tried to rob me of more than money. She'd tried to steal my family, my independence, my dignity. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated a woman who'd spent decades solving problems, analyzing evidence, and refusing to accept things at face value. I picked up the fake succulent and smiled. Sometimes the smallest things can reveal the biggest truths. And sometimes being underestimated is the best advantage you can have. Victoria Sterling was going to spend the next several years learning that lesson the hard way. If you're watching this, don't forget to subscribe and share your story in the comments. Remember, family isn't about expensive gifts or grand gestures. It's about showing up, paying attention, and never being too proud to admit when you've been wrong. Most importantly, never let anyone convince you that your experience and instincts don't matter just because you're getting older. Sometimes, being the little old lady everyone underestimates is exactly the disguise you need to catch the real criminals. Thanks for listening, and remember, trust your gut. It's usually trying to tell you something important.